Welcome back, Shop Rats. Today, I'm just out here doing a little shop reset after working with Matt this past weekend and kind of getting stuff put back in place so we can go to the next phase because my buddy Chris is coming in just a few days and we've got another project that we're going to be working on. But anyway, today it's a Talk About It Tuesday, and I wanted to talk a little bit about at least what back in the day, back when I worked in the hot rod shop in the 80s, what the different classifications were based upon model years for cars. So, kind of a fun topic. Things have changed a little bit, maybe, but let's go back to the roots. Let's go back to kind of the origins. I'm Mike.
Watch as we transform junk into polished metal miracles. This is My Cars Shop.
I suppose it comes with age that inevitably definitions change over time. But back in the day when I did work in the hot rod shop, there were some pretty clear cut guidelines on what different model years meant and what classifications they fell into. And I've been scratching my head a little bit over the last probably 20 years actually, over trying to figure out some of this stuff. You know, it's like when we get into Dodge pickups, they talk about first gens and second gens. And to be honest, I still don't get why those classifications, because when I think of a first gen Dodge, I think of something, a first gen Dodge truck, I think of something from the 40s. And they're referring to those trucks from the 70s, I think. And it's younger guys for the most part, I think, that have kind of brought in these classifications, or at least I was never aware of them. But I certainly wouldn't think of a 74 Dodge D100 as being a first gen Dodge. Even trucks from the 60s I don't consider to be a first gen Dodge. To me, the first gen Dodges were the fat fender Dodges that came out, or maybe even the big power wagons or something like that. So things change. I get it. But I wonder where some of these definitions come from. So I thought it'd be good to just circle back around today and talk about way back in my day, Sonny, when we would talk about all these old cars, we had clear-cut definitions of what they meant. I laughed because it was probably when I used to be involved in the ham, if you're familiar with that, for old fat fender cars, and I don't even know what to call that stuff, but the stuff like Iron Trap Garage does, all of the old stuff from in the 20s, 30s, 40s, vintage stuff. And I'm there in my complete ignorance, not knowing any better. And to me, any of the fat fender cars, which would have been basically 32 to 48, those were the year classes that we called street rods. And all of them were street rods. It didn't matter if it had a small block Ford in it, a small block Chevy, or a flathead. Back when I worked at the rod shop, those were the street rods. And you would go to the part catalogs and you would find that that's what they said, 32 to 48 street rod parts and stuff like that. And those were the restoration parts and the hot rod parts for those cars. Previous to 1932, they were the hot rods. They were the T buckets and all the early A's and all the Model A's actually. So when it switched from Model A to Model B, which was the 32, that became more the street rod generation of cars, and everything previous to that was either a restored antique or a hot rod. My 1926 Oakland is obviously not a hot rod, but it is a restored antique. It's a 1926, and it would have all been lumped into the antique and hot rod classification. Now, the 48 and 49 split for the street rods was because of the change in the fenders, where the fenders were more molded into the car in the 49 Ford than hanging on the car like they were in the 48 Ford. And so that was the clear line between, back in those days, we called street rods and customs. Now, customs didn't mean the car was necessarily always customized, but anything from 49 to about, I want to say 54. Michael, you might be able to clarify me on that one. You kind of have some of this similar background, I'm sure. Ferro Iron and Customs, give him a shout out, go over to his channel, give him a sub. Those were the customs, and then like 55 5, 6, 7, up until early 60s were classic cars. Okay, so your 57 Chevys and your 55 Bel Airs and uh, Fairlanes and all the stuff that came out in that 50s era we consider to be the classic cars. As I think about it, that probably carried up even into the 60s. The line in the 60s between the classic cars and the muscle cars was not as clearly defined. I would say probably with 65, 66 era was when it started to be the muscle car era. When the big motors started coming, I know there was some previous to that. So that line, in my memory, was not really clear cut, but it definitely is clear cut on the other end that the muscle car era ended in 1972 when they started dropping the compression and putting smog crap on. Some people might argue 70, but back in the day, clearly, um, I remember that line of 72, 73 and up. They were nothing. We didn't have a classification for those cars. They were cool cars, but they were kind of, at that point in time, they were kind of like, yeah, they're kind of wannabe cars. And I suppose to some degree that's still true. I mean, I love the 73 Scoops and I love my 74 Swinger, but I really like the 68 Dart much better than the other two darts, just because 68 GTS is definitely muscle car era car. Even the 70 Duster over here, this car would solidly land at the tail end of the muscle car era. 340, 3-speed, all factory original, numbers matching, blah, blah, blah. This definitely falls into that category. And then we never really had a class moving forward. There was cool cars moving forward. I'm certainly not saying there wasn't. Even in the mid to late 70s, I had a 78 Aspen RT, which was an absolute turd as far as power. It was a cool car. And you get into the 80s, the Hurst Olds, the Monte Carlo SS, other ones in that era. Of course, Corvettes have always been kind of their own thing. They never played by anybody else's rules. So I don't know where you go from there, if there are classifications other than like in the trucks. There's the second gen, third gen, 10th gen. I don't know. Back in the day, those were the classifications that we went by in the hot rod shop when we were building cars and when we were selling parts, and we'd go to the catalogs. And I probably still have a lot of those catalogs upstairs in the library in the warehouse, boxed up somewhere. It'd be fun to dig those out because I know I took a bunch of them, of old ones that we were going to scrap. I would take them home to lust over at home on my own when I wasn't working. I'm going to bet that J-Bo over at Bad Tree Productions, if he's watching this, he'll have some similar recollections to these same things. I mean, clearly 48 was the cutoff for a lot of the hot rod and street rod shows back in the day. They didn't allow cars. The Good Guys shows didn't allow cars in the early days. Over 1948, that's changed. I remember going to a Good Guys show in Waukesha, Wisconsin, probably close to 20 years ago, and there was all kinds of muscle cars there. But back on Street Rod Nationals, stuff like that, then they never let anything in. Those are customs, and those don't belong in these shows. It was a very hard line. And even muscle car shows didn't allow stuff in previous to 65, 66. There may have been a few exceptions, but probably not. So even those big Hemi cars from the 50s, they were considered classics. They weren't muscle cars at that point. Muscle cars were definitely of an era. Obviously, I was young and pretty confident in my understandings, but I remember talking to the guy that owned the hot rod shop, and these were the things that definitely were the parameters that we went by. We did talk about that, even with my buddy Jack, the guy who taught me how to paint way back in the street scene days in Marquette. Those were the common definitions that we understood and most of our customers understood back in those days. And when we go to the shows, the huge St. Ignace Car Show and the other hot rod, street rod shows that we would go to, that was kind of it. So I think those have changed a lot. And I'm always curious how these things morph and change. I think some of it is like I got flamed about having, by some people, not by a lot of people, but got flamed by having my 47 Ford, which has a small block Chevy engine in it, which was a very common, that was what we did back in the 80s. We threw a small block Chevy in everything. There weren't as many purists out there back then as there are now. There were some, but they weren't nearly as obnoxious about it. But when I got involved in the ham, I know I got a little bit of crap because I didn't have a flathead in it, and it wasn't a hot rod, and it's one of those 80s street rods, and you kind of got I get it. We're looking for an identity. We want something that we can be proud of and feel special about, and be maybe a little elitist in. Um, Honestly, I've gotten crap on for that car in Ford groups because it's got the Chevy motor in it. I'm an 80s guy. I grew up in the 70s, and that was a very common. I mean, I read Hot Rod magazine from 1978 up until 1985, probably. I was subscribed. My buddy Ron bought me a subscription every year for my birthday. I pored over those magazines, and everything. All these old Fords got small block Chevys put in them. That was the thing you did back in the day. I mean, even today it's true, but especially back when I built that car, more than 10 years ago, I looked at putting a Ford motor in it. I didn't have one readily available. I'm not a huge fan of the small Ford V8. It's a good motor, don't get me wrong. I'm just not a big fan of it. I grew up around them, around Mustangs, 302s, 289s, all that stuff. I know the product pretty well. I'm just not a huge fan of it. I fell in love with Mopar when I was 15 years old, and I've pretty much been Mopar ever since. And I considered putting a Mopar engine in that Ford. But I started looking at the dollars and the cents of it, and my intention for the car, which was do it as inexpensively as possible. And believe me, I wasn't doing that on a shoestring like I'm doing most of this stuff. Do it as inexpensively as possible, and look at the resale value. And the resale value on that car at the time with a small block Chevy, and it was higher than with a Ford motor in it. Now that may be changed, but back then that was the case. Also, parts availability. At that time, I planned on driving that car all over the country. I started building that car in 2000. When did I buy that car? 2005, 6, in that era. And the plan was for Becky and I to take that on our 20th anniversary, maybe, and travel across the country with it. And at the time, and I still think it's true today, you could walk into almost any auto parts in the country, and they had a fuel pump, valve cover gaskets, all the stuff for a small block Chevy on the shelf. They didn't have it for Fords. They didn't have it for Mopar. So to me, practically speaking, if I'm going to drive that car all over the country, it makes sense to put a motor in it that I could walk into any auto parts and walk out in 5 minutes with what I needed, get back on the road and go. I guarantee you couldn't do that for a flathead. Not even for a small Ford, really. So anyway, that's a little bit of a bunny trail off of the intent of the video, which was to just talk about those old school classifications. Drop it down there in the comments. If you're an old fart like me, what do you remember? And if you're a lot older than me, what do you remember? What were the classifications back in the 50s on stuff? Because I certainly don't know. I've never asked my dad, but he was not as big a gearhead as I am. I'm sure he would be, or he had a 51 Ford convertible with a flathead in it. So he might have some awareness. I don't know. I just never thought to ask him. Anyway, that'll do it for this one. I appreciate you being here. Like, share, and subscribe. And as usual, we will catch you on the next one. Well, I'll be here. You should be too.
All the cool kids are doing it.
You know you want to.
Rock!